Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome aboard. So it's taking me a few extra seconds to get ready. Thank you for your time. Let's keep the meeting over here. We'll go back there. Go. Okay. So it is a brand new year in the years of Parshas, that is, because we've had already after Rosh Hashanah one class, but it's a new start, it's a new beginning in the order and the cycle of learning the Parshas of the week. And it's at this time when we begin again, it's when we remind ourselves that it's not only learning data, information, just knowledge that we're pursuing, because of course there's endless amount of information to be learned about the Torah and from the Torah, but more so, more than all of that, we're looking for life messages, messages that are relevant to us where we are today. And in that sense, learning Parshas Noach now is very different the way we learned Parshas Noach last year and the year before, because each year brings its own set of circumstances. Hopefully, we've grown since last year and we have new ambitions, maybe new responsibilities, but clearly Hashem has new expectations from us, and that's why He's given us another day, another week, another year, and a new cycle of learning from Parshas Noach. So as we embark on another year of learning, Parsha discussions, we want to keep it fresh, and we don't want to limit ourselves to what we learned in the past. Instead, we want to build off and upon everything that we have already and to continue to grow in that sense. And that's true of everything in life. As we come back to something which is familiar, we are encouraged to keep it fresh and enter it with a new perspective. Okay, if that's the case, we're still going to keep the same format. We're going to do three steps. We're going to talk about what's going on this week on the calendar. Well, we're talking about what's going on this week in the Parsha. And then from there, we're going to talk about one practical, relevant life message that we can learn from this week's Parsha that will encourage us to be super focused, uplifted, and very, very passionate about bringing Mashiach, internalizing it, and making it our reality today. So, what's going on this week in the calendar? I would say, tell me what you think is going on in the calendar, but part of the answer is going to be, it's supposed to be at least, the word nothing. It's supposed to be, it's just regular. Because as we finish celebrating Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shemini Atzeres, Simchas Torah, it's supposed to go back to absolute boring normal. And we're supposed to somehow be able to bridge from the entire month packed with excitement and bring it into regular, simple, mundane. So let's make as if we're going to say that in a minute, because there are a couple of highlights nonetheless in this week. And then we'll go back to saying that it's just regular plain. So some of the highlights that are the exception is the fact that this week we will be marking Rosh Chodesh. And this is the first time we're calling it Rosh Chodesh this year, because although we had the first day of the year, which happened to be the first day of the new month of Tishrei, we didn't call it Rosh Chodesh. We actually didn't even say Hallel on that day. Because on Rosh Hashanah, we call it the head of the year rather than the head of the month. So the head of the year is extremely important, and we spent a lot of time talking about it. Today we're going to focus on the idea that Rosh Chodesh, renewal, is an innovation of the lunar calendar. It's a month that runs by this moon that has newness every month. Because in the solar calendar, there is nothing monthly about the sun. There is nothing monthly about the sun in the solar calendar. And the fact that there are 12 months, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, whatever you have, is only because they're borrowing the concept of short bursts of time that are more manageable, completely arbitrary in a sense, where we've just taken what would be 365 days and we split them into 12 months, similar to a lunar year. But when Hashem made a Jewish calendar, which started actually the very first mitzvah, was for the Yiddish people even before we left Egypt. We were told that from now on we are going to have a mitzvah to create a calendar that will be lunar based, follow the moon. Big part of that calendar was the innovation of having waxing and waning, renewal. Things are going good, and then there are challenges, and things are going good, and there are challenges, and we have to continuously strive to renew, which is what the moon's message to us is. And Rosh Chodesh, especially Rosh Chodesh, is there to tell us exactly that. It's there to tell us that we may have worked extremely hard over the Yom Tovim period. We may have been extremely inspired. Equally, and at the same time, we may have been very worn out and very tired from the intensity of what was going on. Was it good Shabbos? Was it good Yom Tov? Was it good Moed? Was it both? Was it everything? We could struggle to keep up with everything that was going on. And all of that is what Tishrei is supposed to be. And as we finish all the Yom Tovim, and we are the last few days of the month of Tishrei, we're now bridging into the month of Mar Cheshvan, which is emphasized by Rosh Chodesh renewal to tell us that everything that was all that excitement, whether it encouraged us or whether it distracted us, when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, we're about to dig in deeper and be able to come back at regular day-to-day life with renewed energy. And that's Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh Mar Cheshvan. Rosh Chodesh Mar Cheshvan will be on Wednesday night and Thursday. So Tuesday night, tomorrow night, Thursday, Wednesday, and Wednesday night, Thursday will be the new month of Mar Cheshvan. And it's a very important time to remind ourselves that the normal things in life, the regular stuff in life, are also extremely treasured and precious by Hashem. And therefore, we have every right to consider ourselves important, because Hashem does. And we have every right to hold ourselves to a higher standard, because Hashem does. And therefore, we should celebrate all the good things that we managed to achieve, because Hashem also celebrates all those important things. And when we find ourselves with certain areas that we want to improve on, we should see them as opportunities, just as Hashem does. He sees them as opportunities specially designed by Him, so that we may be able to continue to renew and grow out of whatever it is Hashem brings us in life. So this is one of the important things about Rosh Chodesh Mar Cheshvan. And then we can go back to saying, well, that's exactly what Mar Cheshvan is. Regular day-to-day life. And the Rebbe would make a big emphasis, a big point, out of saying that this week's Parshah, Parshas Noach, is always the first full week of no excitement. Even though we've said this Rosh Chodesh, but this is the first full week of the year where you don't have any Yom Tovs, because Parshas Bereshis will always have a Simchas Torah somewhere in that week. But Noach is a regular run-of-the-mill week, and that's exactly where we want to set the standard. And the standard is there is no limit. We can always give ourselves more encouragement. We can always tell ourselves, well done, and we can always say it's the normal things in life that really matter to Hashem. So that's what we're up to, is Parshas Noach. And having said that it's so plain, let's look at what Parshas Noach tells us about things that are plain. We'll do a quick rundown of what Parshas Noach discusses, and we'll then go into one practical, relevant life message. Now, the word Noach, the name Noach, is synonymous with. It automatically conjures and brings up the story of Noach. Noah and the flood, Noah and the ark, call it whatever you want. But Noach and his survival of the flood, it's such an important story. There were 10 generations before him and 10 generations after him that get almost no mention. Even though there were some tremendous stories that were taking place in those early days of creation, they don't get the mentions. Noach gets a full-on, long parsha describing in very great detail the journeys of Noach, because his life story is an important message for us. In a nutshell, before we get into the details of what happened in the parsha, Noach survived the flood. And Noach's message to us is that when we're experiencing a flood, we can follow in his footsteps and equally survive the flood. And what was Noach's secret to surviving the flood? It wasn't to build a submarine that could stay underwater. It was to follow Hashem's instruction on how to find a way to float on the water. And when he figured out a way, when Hashem taught him how to float on the water, the more water that came, the higher Noach rose. To the extent that when the flood finished, his boat, his ark, landed on the highest mountain around. Didn't start there, but it was picked up by the very waters that destroyed everyone else and flooded all those who didn't manage to overcome it. Noach in the Teva, Noach inside the ark, rises and grows from that very disturbing water. And that's exactly what the Baal Shem Tov teaches us as a key message from Parshas Noach in a nutshell is that if you are going to have, if we ever come across a situation where we're feeling flooded, overwhelmed, we can't, unmanageable realities, boy el teva, come into the teva, into the box. Or as the Baal Shem Tov described, the teva can also mean in Hebrew words. Come into the words. Which words are we talking about? The words of tefillah, of davening, prayer, and the words of study, learning Torah. And when it becomes extremely difficult, Tehillim is our friend. And talking to Hashem and saying it like we mean it and meaning what we say. This is how we rise and we ride the waves rather than just try and survive them. We actually have to try and find ways to grow out of them. We would never have chosen to opt for a flood. And Noach didn't either. But when the flood came, it was the teva that changed it from being drowning waters to waters that would rise him higher and bring him up and up. So that's one of the ideas that Noach teaches us just by the name Noach. But let's talk about what actually happens in the Parsha. The opening of the Parsha follows on from last week, where at the end of last week we read that the world in the first 10 generations went from being so close to Hashem, open godliness. It was easy to see the spirit of spirituality as we can see colors on a tapestry. That's how those early generations saw godliness and spirituality. Unfortunately, they were still tempted. And inspiration doesn't mean immune. Unfortunately, human beings can always get tempted, which is what Hashem designed. And it was a very big and messy reality. The human beings had come to such corruption. The world had become so topsy-turvy. Not only the survival of the fittest in an extremely harsh way, but even recognizing Hashem as being in charge became a no-no. And there were very few people who would stay on the straight and narrow. And Noach was one of them. But the world around him was wayward in every sense of the word. And that's when Hashem says to Noach in the opening of etc., Kate's kol basar balafanai. It's time to push the reset button. And the simple meaning that would mean to get rid of the bad guys. In Hasidic meaning, it would mean to be able to bring all of creation to level 2. If creation meant Hashem hiding to allow creation to feel its own existence, the flood was going to be bring all this evil to a stage of where it can start to become exchanged, transformed, and elevated. And that would take an enormous immersion of the entire world into reliving waters, like going to a mikveh, which is what the entire world was submerged into, and thereby allowing the world to become that much more refinable, resensitized, so that the human beings would then be able to start working and cleansing a world that had become corrupt. And that would be the next stage in the intentional planning of the master creator. Hashem was going to make the world become a more workable place. After having poured so much into the world of goodness, it was now time to extract it from the delivery packaging, from the evil that had allowed it to be able to be received into the world, Now it's time to be able to unpack that tremendous goodness Hashem had showered that had gone wayward, but was still invested into this world. It required a little bit of refinement. In order to make that happen, Noach was to take a sample of every creation, but only the ones that hadn't been corrupted. And him, as the human being, with his family, were to be the representative, the sample of humanity that would come out the other side and be workable in a sense that it would be refinable. And that's exactly what happens. The people who were bent on making sure not to behave were adamant that they would never let people like Noach survive. If they were going to die, they were going to make sure nobody else was to survive. And Hashem says, in the middle of the day, in broad daylight, you will enter the Teva, and all those who threaten to not allow you to come in will not be able to do a thing. That's exactly what happened. Noach comes in, and he spends almost an entire year inside the Teva. And he was very busy. He had to bring in the Teva had taken him 120 years to build. He had to collect enormous amount of food or fodder for all those animals. Him and his family were to reside on the top floor. The middle floor would be the zoo, where all the animals were. And on the ground floor, the basement, would be where the waste of an entire year would be left to the bottom. And for that entire year, Noach was busy tending to a miracle of the zoo. We had so many different species that usually tend to kill each other, but they managed to hang out together and to make it work in a setting that was similar to Mashiach's times. It was so peaceful, harmonious, uplifted inside that table for the entire year. Again, this was an investment, making sure that all these sample chosen creatures of creation would then be able to come out the table on the other side and be a much more refined and therefore much more workable level of creation. And during the year, there was the first 40 days and nights where it rained extremely heavy. But not only rained, not only poured, everything was let loose, and water came up from underneath the ground, and water poured down from above, from the heavens, and the teva was tossed and turned and thrown around in the raging water. And after the 40 days and nights, the water still was raging and raging, and it took a long time before the water started to settle. And only after that, the water started to recede. But still, the entire world was flooded. And slowly, slowly, at the end of the time where it started to settle and to recede, eventually Noach sends out the raven and then the dove one time and the second time, and eventually the third time the raven doesn't come back, the dove doesn't come back. And that's when Noach knows that the water has dropped enough for his dove emissary to have found a home elsewhere. And eventually he waits for the command and instruction of Hashem, and Noach leaves the Teva. He leaves the Teva and he goes out into the big wide world and he doesn't recognize it. Olam Chadash Ra'ah. Noach sees the world is entirely different. It's like, where's everything? Where's everything gone? What is this? And of course, in the literal sense, there was total devastation around. On the spiritual sense, he saw a world that had now become much more sensitive and workable to be able to work what Hashem wants. And Noach immediately brings karbonos, offerings, sacrifices to Hashem. He makes a quick calculation that all the animals had come two by two, except for animals that he had been instructed to bring 7 by 7. And therefore he figures these must be the choice animals. These were the animals that were eventually going to be the kosher animals. And Noach brings from them offerings to Hashem. And Hashem accepts the offerings. And he says to Noach, you're asking for forgiveness for humanity. You ought to have done that much earlier. Before I actually brought the flood would have been the right time. But I'm still extremely pleased by your offering. And I will make a covenant with you, Noach, that never again will I push the reset button on humanity. Never again will this ever happen Instead, the rainbow will be a symbol of Hashem's forgiveness. And as we mention each year, the rainbow is exactly the right symbol that Hashem chose because the rainbow is an expression of sunlight shining through the clouds. Clouds on their own block the sunlight. Sunlight is where the goodness and the warmth and the light of the sun shine forth. And when the clouds block the sun, you don't see the sunlight. But when the clouds are somewhat thinner and a little bit more refined, not quite as coarse, the sunlight manages to penetrate through even the clouds. And the result is a rainbow. And this is what happened with the flood. Hashem said, now I can promise that I will never have to reset and destroy humanity. Because even though humans will still have free choice, and we can choose to really corrupt, the world is now in a better place. And even the most corrupted of corrupted, will always have a path back home. The next level of teshuvah has been invented. The human being has been upgraded like the clouds that will allow the sunlight through, even though they may be dark clouds. But the sunlight will manage to penetrate, and that's the rainbow symbol. That even if we've messed up totally, we can still come back. And that's how Hashem could promise that He would never have to flood the world again. Because even though we mightn't be as misbehaving as then, because we have free choice, Hashem will still keep the door open because humanity is being upgraded. And as the story continues, Noach also then goes on to go back to planting. And unfortunately, Noach's first plants were not bread or other sorts of basic staples. And unfortunately, Noach's first choice for a plant was the vine. And he made wine. And it was a very strong wine. And Noach got himself into a mess. And that's how the story of Ham and his son Canaan get cursed by Noach after they were disrespectful to Noach himself. And Shem and Japheth, the two other sons of Noach, get praised and blessed by Noach to be the future. And eventually, Shem was going to become the great-great-grandfather of Avram Avinu, the founder of the Yiddish people. Noach, at this point, is also told that from now on he may eat meat, which up until this point for 10 generations was considered murder and cannibalism to eat meat even of an animal. But as he comes out the teva after the flood, as a more refined creation, Hashem says at this stage, you are refined enough to be able to elevate even the meat of an animal, and that from now on, animals will be permissible for humans to consume, just like it is permissible for humans to consume vegetation from the field. And that's the word of Hashem, of Creator, telling Noach that from now on, you no longer have to be a vegetarian. Along with that came the seventh of the seven Noahide laws, the newest mitzvah, which was Eva Menachai, to not rip off the limb of a living animal and to make sure to respect animal life. And that completed the seven Noahide laws. Now, Noach was the father of his three sons, and all of humanity that were born to them and their children going forward would all have been children of Noach, including every single one of the almost 8 billion people who live in this world today. We're all descendants of Noach, and therefore we're all obligated and bound by the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the seven Noahide laws. These are key connection points for all of humanity to make this world a godly place. The end of the Parsha takes another interesting twist, and that is the story of the Tower of Babel, Tower of Babylon, where years on, the people try to fight against Hashem and try to create a way out, a way around. If Hashem should ever decide to destroy the world, they would have a way around it. And what they thought they would do was build an enormous tower to heaven. And of course, we know the story. The unity amongst these workers was so great they worked together, they were managing to make tremendous progress in their project. Now, if you think about it, they hadn't um, killed, robbed, or wronged each other, but in a sense, they had done something much worse than the people of the flood. They had decided to actively and jointly fight against the Creator Himself. Yet Hashem says their sin is much less than the sin of the corruption of the generation of the flood. Because the lack of unity, when humans fight humans, that's even worse than fighting against Hashem. And therefore their punishment was much less, and their punishment was measure for measure. The unity that they had misused to try and fight against Hashem was all of a sudden extremely challenged in the sense that their language all of a sudden became changed. And instead of everyone speaking the same language, which would allow for more unity, the change of language, all of a sudden different people understanding things differently meant that they could no longer communicate well between each other, and that itself caused enormous amount of discord, and the entire project fell apart, aside from the fact that Hashem destroyed the building that they had built. The end of the parsha is when we find that we meet for the first time ever Avraham Avinu, 10 generations on from Noach, Hashem's prized and first person to rediscover Hashem and the monotheism that would come. It's a big challenge, and we'll talk more about that next week. But all in all, this is a nutshell of what Parshas Noach is about. Now, as you can imagine, Parshas Noach is one of those parshas that we read as fast as we can because there's so much information in it. But there are layers and layers, masses of levels of understanding, even on the literal sense, but certainly in the midrashic, mystical, Kabbalistic sense, and the Hasidic understanding of what was going on back then and what the messaging may be. We're going to go back to the very beginning, something which is almost basic in the story, and it's going to be an opening lesson for something that I think is very relevant to us today. Certainly, if we watch the news, certainly if we discuss the news and we socialize, we often come across people who think differently than us. Sometimes it's just two opinions, and sometimes it's much more than that. It's clear and obvious that somebody is very, very wrong. Someone is way off the deep end, way off the beaten track, in the sense that they are rebelling against the things that are important in life. And at times, we're in a position to help them. And at times, we look and we say, this is so far gone, or this person will never hear what I'm about to tell them. And therefore, the question we're going to ask ourselves is, when someone close to me is making harmful choices and doesn't seem open to change, how do I know when to keep trying and when to just to step back? Is there a way to measure? Is there a way to say, you know what, Atkan, at this point, I can no longer do anything about it. And if I do say that, how do I know I'm not making a mistake? How do I know it's not a cop-out? And am I going to be letting down Hashem? Or is this maybe sometimes the right thing? And of course, this is going to be a question that we struggle with sometimes, but we're looking for what Torah has to tell us. If I can ask you what you feel like saying and what you think the right thing to say might be in these situations, help me out.
The Torah would say, don't leave somebody alone and don't think you can't do anything.
Okay.
Because you must help somebody else. And the way in which you help them, surely, when you know somebody very well or it's somebody very close to you, there could be a look in that person's eyes or face that either tells you they are listening and accepting what you say, or they're so down and demoralized that no matter what you say that particular day, it's no good. But try another day and it may work. Never give up.
Interesting.
Never give up on people.
Wow. So even if today's not the day, maybe down the line or a different time. Very good. Interesting. So don't give up, but sometimes it's okay to take a break or a breather in between.
Yeah,
Interesting.
definitely. If you know that person, you know you can't go on and on offering advice or saying something or thinking of different ways or giving them a pamphlet or telling them to go to someone else. They don't want to listen. It's not the right time. Leave
Timing.
her off.
Timing off. Very good, very good. Any other suggestions that we can add to when it might be appropriate? Unmute, please. Go ahead, Claire.
Um, well, I would say, from my own experience, that it's important to say and to perhaps, if there's a need to deliver information, then to do that and to make sure that the person can perhaps change their choices. But it's not for you to make that choice for them, but perhaps just to be there, even just to hold the hand, is
Mhm.
sometimes just enough. You know,
Wow.
it's it can be hard, and just to stand by and do nothing, I think, is not right.
Wow. But
Mm.
I'm assuming that within the context we're thinking of right now, this is not always easy.
No.
Although sometimes we can imagine it's even worse than that, and that we feel like we don't even want to stand by because it's so extreme. But
Mm.
usually to hold someone's hand and do nothing might be the right thing. I just had this Shabbos, I was walking past down the road, and there was somebody who we know well whose number plate was on a car that was driving, and it was Shabbos. And I was with one of my children, and I said to them, "Let's not look at that car for a second. I'll tell you why." By that time, the car passed by, and I said, "Look, if we see somebody who we know driving on Shabbos, there's actually a halacha that tells us that we have to tell them not to do it." Now, I know that it's possible that it was maybe someone borrowed their car and it wasn't them driving. But if it was them driving, they're not going to appreciate me telling them not to drive on Shabbos under the current setting. And therefore, it's probably best we don't notice them. So as long as we haven't seen them, we don't have to say anything. It happens to be that on Sunday, which was yesterday, I met the guy and he said to me, "How come you didn't wave to me? I saw you on Shabbos." And I explained to him I chose not to see you. And he really appreciated the respect of not putting myself in a situation and was shouting at him. But the idea where sometimes it's not the time. Or sometimes being there and not saying anything is the right thing to do. And sometimes I'm going to suggest that sometimes the right thing to do is to not even be there. And that will allow at a later time that when I am there, I still have I don't know, the word is the repertoire, the bridge is still open, the door is still open to be able to say at the right time something well, because I wasn't there at a time that would have blown the bridge up. So it's tricky. It's not always clear cut. And sometimes it's not our role
But
to speak up.
Rabbi Cohen,
Yes,
um, um, with your example just now with the car driving by, we jump to judgment, don't we?
Mm.
Straight away, oh, he knows better and he shouldn't be driving on Shabbos. But maybe there's a very good reason for him to be
Right. Sure.
driving on Shabbos. Perhaps he's got somebody dying in the car or needs some help, or you just
absolutely.
don't know.
Absolutely. Correct.
So,
Correct. We shouldn't judge. Well said. 100%. I think in this particular situation 2 days ago, I think we weren't quite off mark. And as Sunday demonstrated, they were quite appreciative and we had a good laugh together. And we said, I'm not going to tell them what to do on Shabbos, but if I see that number plate driving again on Shabbos, again, I'm not going to look to see who's in the driver's seat. And
mm,
we appreciated that. The halacha does say that if we see somebody breaking Shabbos, we're obligated to tell them that's not okay. It doesn't say we're obligated to see who's driving on Shabbos. And
mm,
some Rabbanim have openly said that they get to shul the first on Shabbos. And they leave shul the last on Shabbos because they don't have to see who came how. They're
mm,
very happy to see the people in shul. And for
mm,
some people, that's exactly what they need so that when the rabbi does have to say something to them, the bridge is still there and they're
mm,
more listening. And that's actually a step in not ignoring what's going on, in keeping the door open. And it gets a little tricky of when the right time to step in and step out is. What we're going to discuss though today is that there are things that we can do without having to say. bit like Claire said before about holding someone's hand at times, we're going to say even sometimes where even that is not possible, there is still something we can do. And the answer is going to be we can ask and daven on their behalf to ask Hashem to help them grow. And that's even if they don't want to hear, even if they don't want to let you mention a word, we can still daven on their behalf. And we're going to talk a little bit how that is so important because what it does is it shifts it from being a judgment call. How could they do this? Or they should never have done that. They ought to be doing differently. How could they be self-harming? Into a situation where I'm on their team. I'm with them. I don't know why it's happening this way, maybe. I don't know why they're making such terrible choices, but I still pray for them. And there's real power in prayer. And by asking Hashem to help them, I'm actually helping them. Sometimes I can do more than that, but I certainly can daven. And by davening for somebody, by asking Hashem to help them, that is a real gift. That's real care. And when nothing else is available, davening for them certainly is. And that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about and remind ourselves that we have the ability to help people even when they don't want it. And it doesn't have to get funny, awkward. It has to become uplifting. Let's do this inside, and we're going to obviously talk about this, how we see it in this week's Parshah. And the lesson we're going to learn is from what Noach did, from what Noach didn't do, from how the Torah describes what he did, and from how the commentators discuss, including from the Zohar, how to understand Noach. And then the Rebbe is going to be the cream on the cake to make it, it's just brilliant, layer upon layer. Let's read inside, let's cruise through this. These are the opening verses of this week's Sedra. Eile told us Noach, these are the generations of Noach. Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Noach walked with Hashem. Well, that's tremendous. What compliments. Righteous man, perfect in his generation, walked with Hashem. Wow, what a guy. Noach begot 3 sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafes. Now the earth was corrupt before Hashem, and the earth became full of robbery. And Hashem saw the earth, and behold, it had become corrupted, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on the earth. What a description. And Hashem says to Noach, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth has become full of robbery because of them. And behold, I'm destroying them from the earth. So Noach is told, build yourself an ark. This is your new role. And it's not going to take one day. Rome wasn't built in a day, neither was the ark. The ark took 120 years. The Torah describes Noach as the righteous man in his generation who was chosen to survive the flood and through him rebuild all of civilization. Okay, so why was Noach chosen? Seems quite straightforward. He was the only good guy. He was the righteous man in his generation. There was no one else around. He was the only person who could continue civilization in a rebuilt world of goodness. And this was Noach. This was Noach, the man who was a righteous in his generation. Not so fast. Says the Gemara. Gemara Sanhedrin. Rabbi Yochanan says, the verse tells us in his generation. He was righteous in his generation. His generation? Well, where else would he be? Not in his generation? No, says the Rabbi Yochanan. The verse adds the word he was righteous in his generation. He was righteous, but not relative to those of other generations. Had you put Noach in comparison to Avraham Avinu, maybe not so great. But in his generation, compared to the mass corruption going on, he was the one man who stood out. Reish Lakish says the exact opposite. In his generation, he was still righteous. All the more so, if you would have planted him into a less corrupt society, you better believe how more righteous he would have been. All the more so would he have been in other generations, he would have been even greater. You're talking about the greatest person who could go against the flow in the most corrupted society and still hold his guard. What a guy. Same word. Rabbi Yochanan tells us it's downplaying the greatness of Noach. Rish Lakish saying is upplaying. It's telling us even more greatness about Noach. And here comes the metaphor. Rav Chanina says there's a parable for Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. To what is this matter comparable? To a barrel of wine that was placed in a cellar where vinegar is stored. In its place, its fragrance is noticeable. It's the only wine around. When it's not its place, put it amongst other wine barrels, it's just another wine barrel. Its fragrance is not noticeable. Rabbi Shaya said, this is a parable for Rish Lakish's opinion. To what is this matter comparable? To a flask of perfume that was placed in a location of filth. In its place, amongst all the filth, its fragrance is certainly noticeable. And all the more so would it be in a location where there is perfume. And this additional perfume would certainly enhance even more and make it even more pleasant in a room full of perfumes. It wouldn't lower it, it would actually bring out even more the greatness of this perfume. These are the two metaphors that help us appreciate the differences of how we understand the word in his generation. Because as we said, the verse could say Noach was a good guy, he was righteous. It added the words in his generation, b'doresav. What do these additional words teach us? Rabbi Yochanan says it's limiting his praise. It was only there in comparison to the bad guys. He was better. Doesn't mean he was great. Rish Lakish says, no. This guy was great even next to the bad guys. Certainly, even more so, enhancing his praise by saying in his generation he was righteous, certainly in other generations. Okay, actually, Rashi brings down these two opinions. And Rashi tells us these two ways of understanding the extra superfluous words. But the question we're going to ask ourselves is, why? Why does it matter whether Noach was relatively or absolutely righteous? He was the good guy. Why does the Torah want us to discuss this even? More importantly, if the verse could be read either way, it could easily be positive or negative, upplaying or downplaying his righteousness, why would anybody judge Noach unfavorably? Why not judge favorably and interpret its praise? Why is anyone leaning towards bad-mouthing or downplaying Noach's greatness? What's the thought process? More importantly, this is a quote we'll just fly through, but we are told that the Torah is very, very careful not to say anything evil or negative, unless it has to. And here you have an example where the Torah uses a whole bunch of extra words. Instead of saying something which was tamei, it says inana tahira, it's impure. To avoid speaking negatively even about animals. Why would it add words that seem to limit Noach's praise? Just leave them out. Why do you have to make Noach not be so good? And this question is a question, but the answer is so important to us. As Claire pointed out earlier, we have to remind ourselves we aren't the judge. So what is the Torah telling us? We never try and judge people. We try always never to not judge people. But here's the key. Here's another interesting quote from the Zohar, again engaging in almost judging Noach, whether he's to be upplayed or downplayed. Rabbi Yehuda said, come and see, when Moshe prayed to Hashem, he didn't rely on his own merit, but rather on the merit of the forefathers. Which sin are we talking about? The golden calf. When the Jewish people were dancing around an idol 40 days after pledging their allegiance to Hashem. 40 days after we got married, we got caught cheap. And when Moshe comes to the scene, he says to Hashem, I know it's terrible, but in merit of our forefathers, please spare them. They're bad. They've misbehaved. I have nothing to say for them. But in the merit of our forefathers, please still save them. Noach, by contrast, didn't have anyone whose merit he could rely on like Moshe did. What's he supposed to say? And therefore, Noach did not pray for the people before the flood, because what could he say? In whose merit should they be saved? The forefathers hadn't been born yet. These were the forefathers of the forefathers. Well, not forefathers, the forebearers. Rabbi Yitzchak, however, responds to Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, even so, once Hashem told Noach, and I will establish my covenant with you, Noach should have been pleaded for mercy on the people, even though he didn't have who to hang on to. He should have just said, for your mercy, Hashem. Instead, he waited until after the flood to offer a sacrifice. He should have brought it earlier. Maybe it would have calmed Hashem's anger and spared the world. And therefore, Rabbi Yitzchak argues that Noach didn't do what Moshe did. Moshe davened and prayed on behalf of the bad guys, and Noach should have also, but he didn't. Rabbi Yehuda replied, what could he have done? The people of the world were guilty and constantly provoked Hashem. And Noach was afraid for himself. He didn't want to put his own life at risk by getting involved. He saw how corrupt they were, how they angered Hashem every single day, and didn't want to be caught in the downfall. Okay, so we have two opinions in the Zohar, Rabbi Yehuda versus Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yehuda says Noach was a great guy. He did what he could. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, no, he should have done more. And this is our two opinions. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, Noach was a good guy, nothing to blame him for. And Rabbi says, no, Moshe should have prayed regardless. And here we have the same question. Why would anyone try and put down Noach? What do we hope to gain from that? What do we hope to learn? Why would the Torah tell us this? Of course, the answer is going to be so profound. It's so important for us to remember. Just by starting off, I said, you know what? Let's save the nugget of the answer and then we'll flesh it out. The answer is going to be that Noach in his time didn't do anything wrong. He couldn't. But the message for us is that we can always, yes, do something about it. So although Noach can't be held accountable, we can. And therefore, it behooves us. We should always push to continue trying to pray. And that's why it's important for us to hear Rabbi Yitzchak say, no, don't think Noach has the final say. Or Rabbi Yochanan say, Noach was great, but only in his generation. In our generation, we're expected to have more. And what's that more going to be? Never give up. What does never give up mean? You can always do something for another person, even if they are at the peak of evil. You can still daven for them. And the way we're going to learn that is by the Torah mentioning something to downplay the messaging from Noach. So here goes. The introduction we're going to do is we're going to come back to explaining what this message is. This is going to be the key. The key lesson is going to be we can always help even the worst of the worst. If not directly, indirectly by davening for them. Here goes. The number one thing is to recognize that there's a difference between somebody who is not yet mature to somebody who has already started to become mature. One of the key differences is going to be the black and white simplicity of a child. Something's either good or bad. You're either a police or a robber. You're either a good guy or a bad guy. And nuance and gradations is just beyond the scope. We don't get it. And then all of a sudden, we start to mature and start to realize that even though some things are sometimes the wrong thing to do, that very same thing is sometimes very important and very good to do. Equally, somebody who might have made a terrible mistake doesn't mean they're a bad person. They made a terrible mistake. And all of a sudden, we start to see that the perspective, the nuance, varies from place to place. And as we learn to notice that, we can come back to one same scenario, and it's the same storyline, and we can see the same story from different perspectives. It takes some maturity to get that. So you can have one story of Noach and the ark, and that same story could be looked at from Noach's perspective. It could be looked at from the perspective of the rest of his generation. It could be looked at from the perspective of Hashem looking down at Noach. And it could be looked at from their perspective of people like you and I, who learn the Torah and read his story and are searching for a message from his story. And from our perspective, we may very well be seeing something different than he saw from his perspective, and they're both correct. They're just from a different angle. And this is what we have to realize, that although the Noach story is a story that actually took place, as recorded in the Torah, the message that we learn from Noach sometimes needs to be emphasized one way or a different way to help us appreciate the lesson and messaging we take from Noach. And here is where the Torah gives us a gift and adds the word b'doyroisav. In his generation, he was righteous. Because although Noach, from his perspective, did everything he had to do and was a very good boy, exceptional in a generation of corruption, we, as we learn that story, the Torah has to add a word that will tell us that for us, we have to somehow not learn Noach as a complete role model. We have to take it down one notch, not because he did anything wrong, and not because if we were in his place, we would do it better, but because we're not in his place. We're learning his message for a generation that we are in, and therefore, in his times, it was right. In our times, we are more expected from us. In his generation, in his times, B'day Rosav, he was tzaddik. But for us, in our generation, that's not enough. We have to push more. Let's read it inside. This is a quote from Gemara that often says, Mar amachada or mar amachada v'lei pligi. You can have two opinions. One says this item is kosher. One says this item is not kosher. I mean, that's the biggest argument, disagreement you can have. I mean, that's black and white. And the Gemara then turns around and says, actually, these two, one says it's kosher, one says it's non-kosher, are not arguing. They both agree. They're talking about two different things. One sage said one thing, another said something else, but they're not arguing. When I learned this the first time in Gemara, it took me so long to wrap my head around. One guy says yes, one guy says no, and it's not an argument. It's just brilliant. But that's what nuance is. That's what maturity is. And for us, we want to be able to understand that although there's a story of Noach that we can learn from, as we grow older, the nuance allows us to learn even more from the Noach story. Reevaluating the debate. The sages who praise Noach address historical Noach. Noach from his perspective. He remained righteous despite his generation and fulfilled everything expected from him in his time and context. In his generation, he was passed with flying colors. He was the top of the line, the most ideal. The same time, that same story, the other sages who seemingly limit Noach's praise, make him look a little less brilliant, are addressing our relationship with Noach, what that means to us in a different generation. His circumstances were different from ours. So we should not emulate everything, especially regarding praying to Hashem. And as I mentioned, Rabbi Yitzchak says he brought offerings after the flood. He, at least in our situation, we should pray before the flood and ask Hashem for mercy and beg on behalf of somebody else. And this is going to be the answer number one. Debating Noach's righteousness is not judging Noach. It shows that the Torah is both describing his greatness in his time, so we can learn how big he was, and at the same time, teaching us lessons for today that we can do more, and that would be to pray. Now, the next step is going to be to discuss how we can pray for somebody to make a good choice. Doesn't it go against the whole idea of free choice? How can we ask Hashem to bail someone out from their own choices? How would that allow them to have free choice? Isn't it a basic tenet in Yiddishkeit that people have freedom to choose? So the answer is going to be, we're running against the clock, we'll just say it outside. The answer is going to be that we have to choose from the circumstances Hashem sets us up with. Sometimes the challenge is turned up and it gets very tempting and it's very difficult to make the right choice. And sometimes Hashem has mercy on us and makes it easy for us to make good choices. Sometimes we just happen to hear something extremely inspirational, or we happen to walk past and meet somebody who's so switched on, and that gives us what it takes to overcome the next challenge. And when we daven to Hashem that somebody should have the moral courage to make a good choice, that absolutely fits in with free choice. There are many other answers, including the fact that asking Hashem to have mercy allows the person to be able to bring out their inner neshama, which they have as well, and not just to make a free choice. But certainly on every level, there is nothing to stop us from praying for even the worst of the worst, to be encouraged to be able to make a good choice. This is so important for us to hear. We have to hear it over and over again. But then there's something else. Where's it gone? I lost the slide. Where's the slide? Where's it gone? Here. Another important aspect, and here the Sikha takes it to the next level. The Torah includes a critical reading of Noach to warn us never to focus only on ourselves, since we have the tools and responsibility to help others. One of the big deals that came out from the whole flood and being saved by the ark is that everybody who survived the flood together. And therefore, we have to look out for each other. And we have responsibility for one another. So although Noach didn't want to get involved with a generation that had become so corrupt, we have the ability to daven safely and pray on behalf of those who need the help to make good choices without letting go, even if it means keeping a distance and staying clear from the challenge. The end of the Sikha tells us we learn from what Noach didn't do what we must do. We learn a lot from Noach what he did do. But the fact that Noach is recorded in the Torah with a slight element of downplaying teaches us what we can do, but is still an attribute and a gift from the lesson we learn from Noach, albeit in a non-direct way. It's still a merit to Noach that we allow ourselves to encourage one another and ourselves and to never give up hope on anybody. And therefore, in a subtle way, Noach is greater than his own greatness. Noach's greatness in his time was to go to the greatest he could be in his generation, which means to keep the straight and narrow. But in an indirect way, by the Torah mentioning the word B'dorosov, he gifts us with something that is way past his own time and generation. He teaches us that today we can do more than that. And just as Noach was able to go against the flow in his time, we can do the same in our time. And as we said, in our time, we can do more than Noach, but we must also carry that passion, that determination, that commitment, like Noach did, to not look around and see, well, is everyone else doing that? Instead, we say, if this is what we can do, even if no one else is davening for so-and-so, even if everyone else has given up on so-and-so, I won't. Just as Noach did what he could do, be against the flow, we can learn from Noach in our generation to do more than Noach, but with the same determination and commitment against the flow as Noach did in his times. And when we do that, we ride the waves. And the waves lift us stronger. And instead of tearing us apart, they bring us closer. Instead of making us indifferent, they make us more caring people. And that's a real gift to ourselves, to Hashem's wonderful world, and it's a lesson that will allow us to ride through difficult waves that unfortunately are part of our reality until a time where Mashiach comes speedily today and we see the light and the greatness of all this journey, the destination where we're looking forward to reaching. I hope we've learned something today. Yashar, thank you for joining. It's great to be back. And Bez Hashem, all being well, same time, same place next week. Yashar, everybody.
Thank you.
Sei gesund.
Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Thank you.